Hello, I'm Adam,
I'm Adrian.
and welcome to Cast from the Crypt. Today we're talking about 1958's Dracula. So there was confusion on the title.
What do you mean?
I was looking at like a bunch of posters for it, and half of them call this movie
Oh,
Dracula, the other call it Horror of Dracula. I found out that this is a British film, but for whatever reason, they changed the film from just Dracula to Horror of Dracula for the American release. They thought because there was the 1933 movie?
31.
1931, yeah. The 1931 movie starring Bela Lugosi they thought would cause confusion, but that movie exists in England as well, so I don't quite understand the
I
motive.
think it's probably because Universal would have maybe not let it come to market
Yeah, really weird.
if they didn't change the name. Because I don't know, Universal's just that kind of entity, and Hammer Horror, who is the independent group that well, actually, the production company's name is Hammer Film Productions, and then Hammer Horror produced the horror films. They were independent, and I just don't think that they wanted to compete with an independent production studio. That's my theory. I could be wrong, but Universal sucks. So,
Damn. You're sick of it.
I mean, hey,
You're sick
it's
of
whatever,
it. Yeah, okay.
you know. But yeah, Dracula, Horror of Dracula. I've been calling it Horror of Dracula just because I kind of like that name. But yeah, the 1958, and in my opinion, a really fun one. What did you think?
I really enjoyed it watching it. I've never seen it before, but I've been meaning to, like, since forever.
Here's what's funny. It's the only one of the, well, this is no longer true. I watched another one this morning. But up until this point, it was the only, like, Christopher Lee Dracula movie I've ever seen. But I love Christopher Lee in literally everything else. Now I love him in One More Thing, and I can't believe I didn't see this earlier.
That's what this movie's known for, right? It's Christopher Lee Dracula movie. I think this is what really made him big. It's definitely what, from here on out, typecast him as sort of like the villain.
Absolutely. And it's something that he has, or that he used to complain about quite often, was he got caught in the Dracula rut. What's cool about the English Dracula, brought to you by Hammer Films, is that it's a franchise. So the first Dracula film that we're covering today is one of a very lengthy franchise, and most of those movies in the franchise were starring Christopher Lee, though not all. There are several that he managed to break away from. And we don't really have that here in the States. We have the one Bela Lugosi Dracula film. Though Bela Lugosi's dying wish, I don't know if you know this, it's super tragic. He wanted to do a Dracula remake in Technicolor, but at that time, science fiction had kind of taken a hold of everybody. Horror movies weren't very popular anymore. They were doing aliens and robots and stuff like that, and the studio didn't make it. And he never got to do that. He was literally buried in his Dracula garb.
Was he?
He was. Yeah, he
You're
was.
kidding.
He loved it. No. He was buried in his Dracula costume.
I have in the past said, bury me in this outfit or bury me in this costume, but he literally meant it. Bury me in this costume.
Supposedly, so there's like an urban legend that was his dying wish. I don't know. I've read things that are, he was buried in the clothes despite his last wishes. I've also read that it was his last wish. I've read that he was indifferent. I don't know. It's hard to get a clear answer on that. The only thing that is true for sure is that he was buried in his Dracula outfit.
I really think it's funny that like he didn't want to, and then someone was like, "But let's bury him in the costume."
Christopher Lee was really, really hoping to not be associated with Dracula, which is super funny. I just love the contrast there. And I don't know, that knowledge kind of made this movie and the subsequent film that I watched this morning all the more interesting because he's still so effective.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is what he was known as for the longest time, and to me and you, he's in younger audiences and people nowadays, I think he's not known as Dracula primarily, but probably for the longest time in his career, until he was an old man, he was Dracula.
Right, right. And I listened to a really interesting interview with him where he is really, really complimentary of Hollywood. And he talks about how Hollywood, they put him in positions that the English film industry never would have. Like in England, he was just Dracula. And in the US, he did a comedy where he played a straight-laced businessman by day and like gay biker by night. And he said it was his favorite role he ever did. And I'm interested to know what he felt about Saruman because that though the director's not American, it was a film produced by an American studio. So I'm interested to know what he felt about that casting. But he was very complimentary to Hollywood. He said that he felt that they saved his career and gave him something to be proud of, which is just shocking because I love what I've seen of the Hammer Dracula movies. This one I loved a lot. And I actually think I liked the second one I watched more. I believe it was called the Satanic Rites of Dracula or something like that. But man, it was fun. So I'm excited to talk about this one.
Yeah, I might have to give it a look. Here, Christopher Lee, too, when they first revealed Dracula, this is easily the youngest version of Christopher Lee I have ever seen. And it was almost startling at first to see him as a young man and not some old strange wizard or something. But part of the appeal of this movie and this character was that he was, like, back in the day, he was sexy Dracula. He was the original. I mean, maybe you could argue for Bela Lugosi, but he's the original sexy Dracula.
Well, I know that people felt the same way about Bela Lugosi, but with this particular Dracula movie and franchise, they really upped the sex factor. In the novel, have you read the book?
I have.
Yeah, in the novel, there is a I don't know, I guess like an overarching metaphor of sexual repression throughout Bram Stoker's original book, and so that's not new to these movies. But I don't think that they could do in the 30s what they did with this particular film, because it does feel significantly sexier. What I loved about this particular adaptation,
initially, the first monster they have to contend with is Dracula's bride.
Right.
She's simply credited as vampire woman. Not even bride of Dracula or anything.
Her name fittingly is Valerie Gaunt.
Ooh, that is, yeah.
Which I think is hilarious.
So I thought it was interesting. I think in the last episode I said this, but one of the most consistent things about Dracula is the fact that he has 3 brides. And in this movie, he only has 1. In my mind, I like to think polygamy was just too much for the 50s. That's what I like to think.
Yeah, he does usually have 3 brides. But I don't know. I don't know what happened here. It didn't bother me though.
No, it didn't.
But I did notice it as well. This movie has a really, aside from Valerie Gaunt, who has a fantastic and vampire-y name, this movie has a very great cast. Primarily the 2 leading men. Dr. Van Helsing, played by Peter Cushing, which is super cool. I had no idea that he was in this movie. But Peter Cushing, of course, I'd say maybe most famous to American audiences for playing Grand Moff Tarkin in Star Wars. But had a very, very successful career in England, especially in this time period, the 50s, doing Hammer films. He did stuff. I think he portrayed Sherlock Holmes, and he was in The Mummy, and he had big roles.
I actually saw that him and Christopher Lee are in another Hammer movie after this that's not a Dracula movie. And I think they probably typecast similarly.
Do you know what it is?
What?
it's Frankenstein, and Frankenstein's monster is Christopher Lee, and Baron Frankenstein is played by Cushing, Peter Cushing.
Good, good. I mean, so now Christopher Lee's got two classic horror movie monsters. Yeah, Peter Cushing. I mean, they're both Star Wars alumni too. Now, so,
weird, right? That's true.
They've been working together for a long time in a lot of movies, and I never really noticed that until looking into the background of this movie.
Yeah, supposedly they were friends. Christopher Lee had a lot of friends that he worked with. He worked with friends quite often. Like, it was something he became famous for. Like, I know he was friends with Boris Karloff, and I think they ended up doing a movie together before Boris Karloff died, but...
Well, I was saying that I think Christopher Lee is so interesting because he is always typecast as the evil villain, and maybe it is because he's so imposing and he has such a deep voice, but any interview I've seen with him, or like any of these, stories you hear about him, like, he seems like he was probably kind of easygoing and personable, like he's made friends with everybody. He's pretty chill, I like to imagine.
Yeah, I mean, and he was married to the same woman his whole life. He started in England and then like lived a very quiet life in America after that, and had lived there for many years, and a fairly unassuming guy for somebody that played so many baddies, and like iconic ones too. I obviously Saruman, but he's fantastic in The Wicker Man.
Oh man, do I love The Wicker Man.
Yeah, and also they play up the sexy thing in The Wicker Man too.
Yeah, he's 50 like, sexy though. You know what I mean? like,
I mean,
by today's
they were playing to their audience.
Yeah, definitely
at the time.
Yeah, definitely. That's another thing I noticed in this movie is there's a few scenes of him just standing, in the full Dracula attire, and he's so imposing. Like, he is. Physically was, like, really tall, wasn't he? Especially for the 50s.
Yeah, he's 6'4".
Yeah, wow. And then that deep voice, like...
Right.
He has the look about him of, I guess, a good, intimidating villain, is why he's typecast like this.
One of my favorite moments in the movie, and one of his favorite moments, too, because, it was in the same interview, I think, that I heard this. He snuck into a movie theater to watch this movie in the theater, like a regular showing, right? Not the premiere that an actor would be invited to. And when they first introduce Dracula, when you see his silhouette and Jonathan Harker stands at the foot of the stairs waiting for him to come down, and they show Dracula's silhouette in the darkness, the audience, in fact, like, I think it was like a group of rowdy guys, they laughed because they thought it was corny, and they were expecting that Bela Lugosi Transylvanian accent, which, for the record, people shouldn't laugh at because he really did talk that way. But that's fine. But anyway, the audience was laughing, and there was a rowdy bunch in front of him. And what took them by surprise and caused them to be quiet for the rest of the film was his demeanor when he actually speaks. This Dracula isn't the same. It's not some ripoff of the 30s Dracula that and will often imitate, right? It's not that thick accent. In fact, he's very composed, has a sincerity to him, and is really smooth and suave. He almost talks like he could be playing Bond, right? But he's not. And so our first introduction to the Count is incredibly shocking. And for me, dude, I was like riveted. I was very excited to see where it would go, because I've never seen a depiction of Dracula that way.
Yeah, they always go to like this ghoul, basically,
Right, cartoony.
Especially up until this point, but in the book, he is seductive. And that's something they never really touched on in any movies up until this one. Okay, well, when this movie starts, it's Jonathan Harker going to Castle Dracula, which is how the book begins. I believe the narration at the beginning of this movie is exactly the narration at the beginning of the book. It's narration of him writing in a journal as we watch him go up to the castle. In the book, the entire story is told through journal entries and letters, and I think a few news articles. It's a very interesting way to tell a story that like you never really hear about when people talk about Dracula. But they use those exact lines, I think, from his first journal entry a few times throughout the story. So whenever that happened, I thought, okay, well, maybe this will be probably a faithful adaptation, if not like a more faithful than I'm used to seeing adaptation. But as the movie went on, it became unfaithful. It became less and less faithful.
No, I noticed that too, and of course, like there is no faithful Dracula interpretation, at least mainstream movie that I know of. I know like Francis Ford Coppola did one in the 90s with Gary Oldman, and I've never seen it, and I've only ever seen like the freakish wrinkled head of Gary Oldman.
Yeah,
in that
I
movie.
have seen it. It's called Bram
faithful?
Stoker's Dracula. That's the name of the movie. And it's not.
And is it?
It's not. No.
Well, that's weird. But
Yeah.
uh, Christopher Lee, was huge on the text. Like he loved the book, and he had this years long, because again he played Dracula for, I don't know how long it was. I don't know if it was 2 decades or just over a decade, but he played Dracula for years in England, and he would battle with Hammer about the dialogue, so much so that in the sequel to the movie, this movie, which is Dracula Prince of Darkness, he literally does not say a line, because he fought them so hard because they refused to put in Bram Stoker's writing that he just hisses in the movie. He has no dialogue. And that's a testament to like how respected Christopher Lee was and how bad people wanted to work with him. But 2, shows that he did have a loyalty to the text, which I just don't quite understand, because this movie is not faithful, as you were saying. Not to say that I didn't enjoy it. I think in the places that it does veer off, it's all very enjoyable. You have to take liberties to make it scare folks in the modern day.
Exactly. I think maybe there isn't really a faithful adaptation of Dracula, or even like Frankenstein for that matter. But I don't know if there has to be. Maybe the fidelity model of adaptation is not the best route to go when adapting those stories. This movie's an hour and 22 minutes. Could we really fit in the entire book in that amount of time? Probably not. So I am always open to change with these Dracula movies.
Yeah, I agree. And, Dracula, Frankenstein, Van Helsing, these are characters that are public domain. People can pretty much do whatever they want with them. And the text, the original text, I should say, exists. And if you want that, you can go find it. And you don't have to watch these movies, right? That's just the truth of it. They're public domain. People can do what they want. And this, as an adaptation, I don't find disrespectful. I find it to really actually kind of spark more interest in the original text if you're me. I'm actually thinking about rereading the book after watching these, just because it's it's gotten me excited again, and this sort of vampire movie, not to be another person to just like tear into modern vampire movies, but this kind of movie makes me want something that's different than what we're getting now. The modern vampire is just like completely insane. And I don't know where people are taking it. I think maybe the last adaptation, or excuse me, the last take on a vampire that I really enjoyed that came out in the last 20 years was I Am Legend. And even that's like a stretch. But this just felt classic, even though it takes many liberties and is very much its own thing.
Oh, definitely. I watched with my brother and I was saying to him, like, it's crazy how much of a classic this movie feels like. 1958, like, what movies do you watch from the 50s? Like, not many, just because that was so long ago. any movie from that era seems like a classic, and it is a classic. But also think about it. This is a remake of a 1933 movie. I guess,
Right.
you know, maybe not a remake, but they had a Dracula movie in 1933. And then the 1933 movie, you could argue, is a remake of a 1922 movie. The story of Dracula has a lineage as old as film.
Yeah, it really does. You're right. And I'll say this. This might be my favorite take on it.
I think I might agree. I think I might agree with you.
Yeah, I don't know if that's unpopular. I kind of want to rewatch Bela Lugosi's. This is taking nothing away from him. He is forever Dracula, right? And he's known as such, and people respect him. I mean, the guy has freaking his image carved into castles in Eastern Europe. I think we know that he's iconic. But like, for me personally, I really, really, really enjoyed this movie, and maybe that's because I'm a big Christopher Lee fan. But I also just think it's a pretty competent film. And I know the critics do too. It still maintains a very high rating. I think it's in the 90s on Rotten Tomatoes. And of course, they're beloved by English audiences and American audiences alike. Now, something I asked you before we were recording, and something I want to ask you now and revisit. Your grandfather liked vampire stuff, okay? Liked Buffy, liked Life Force. I know he had to have seen this movie. Did he write a review on it in his little black book?
His very large black tome. Yes, I have it right here next to me.
Oh, dude, I'm so excited.
But I didn't need it because I knew.
Have we ever set this up? Like, have we talked about your grandfather's book before?
I think we have, but for if nobody knows, my grandfather for the longest time kept like a series of what look like tomes. Like there's I think 5 binders, and one of them is sadly missing, but it's every movie he ever watched, and he wrote a review on it like it's an archaic letterbox. And he has one right here, of course, for Horror of Dracula, and it is one of the very few movies he has given a rating of excellent. But
wow.
Yeah, but I've always known that he loved this movie. He would talk about this movie all the time. He had books on like the production of classic horror movies and like the makeup, and a lot of them were about this movie. So I know he invested like he probably knew everything about the production of this film. Like he really loved it. He really liked the classics, and even though this isn't Bela Lugosi and this isn't the original, he still considered this to be one of the classics.
Wow, that's awesome. What was another movie he had put excellent?
I could literally find like no movies that he considered excellent, but I think we did say it. He also considered Life Force excellent.
That's right. And it is.
Yeah, I think he's just partial to vampires too.
But that's great. That's great to know. I'm glad we're in agreement. All 3 of us. Okay, so it's a fairly basic Dracula plot, but we could get into it just a little bit. We've already established that we open with Jonathan Harker getting to Castle Dracula, and he is what's a departure in this movie from the original text, and one that I really appreciated, was they establish, as he's writing in his diary, that he is indeed there to kill Dracula. He is not there on business like in other takes on this story. And for me, that was a great hook. Like, I was like, oh, okay, I'm in.
Yeah, and maybe that works too as a way to speed up the runtime of this movie. And in the Bela Lugosi movie, in Nosferatu even too, I think so much of those stories are about them discovering Dracula being a vampire and finding out how to kill him and like what vampires are, and discovering he's evil. I think that had been covered by this point in time. So when they made this movie, they basically skipped that part because you know about it already. You know Dracula's a vampire. Okay, let's just get to people are there to hunt him. Basically, before we even encounter Dracula, we encounter this woman who's begging Jonathan, help me. She claims she's been held prisoner in Dracula's castle by Dracula, and she can't say why. She never says why, but she runs off basically, and then Dracula shows up. He greets Jonathan. He shows him around the castle, shows him to his room. This is where Jonathan, I think, writes in his diary that he's here to kill Dracula. Jonathan tells Dracula in his cover, basically, is that he's a librarian. He's there to be Dracula's librarian, which I thought was a pretty weak kind of cover. But I guess Dracula did too, because he gets discovered pretty quickly, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. He does.
I was going to say, this is a departure from the novel, of course. Jonathan Harker visits Dracula because he's basically like a Victorian real estate agent, and he's selling him a house in London.
And then, proceeds to hold him hostage and make him write fake letters. And
yeah.
Okay, there's that encounter where he pulls the woman off of him.
So more continues. This is, there's dialogue between Dracula and Jonathan. This is where we found out, he's here to be a librarian. They're kind of just being civil, and he's being a good host. This is him being suave and charming. He's trying to be a good host and being friendly with him, just like he is in the book, getting his guard down. But after this, Jonathan sees the woman again, and she says, "You have to save me. I can't explain why. Hold me." And we find out she's really just playing the damsel in distress role. Really, when she swoons and throws herself into his arms because she's so delicate flower, she needs him to save her. It was really a trick. This is, of course, Dracula's bride. She's a vampire, and she bites his neck.
And this is way early in the runtime too.
Oh yeah,
for the record. And he gets got. He ends up basically writing his last diary entry, which is, if you've read the book, super funny because, a good quarter or 40% of the novel is his diary entries. And so maybe I expected a little bit more of those in the beginning of the film, but they do not last long. He writes his last entry, and he ends up hiding his book outside, I guess, just in case anybody can find it. And then he enters his death. He basically enters his tomb at this point and decides to go into a crypt in Castle Dracula. He finds both Dracula and his vampire bride in their fantastic coffins. I loved the look of this crypt. It was so rad. He does manage to kill the bride of Dracula using a stake that he had already had. They don't show him make the stake, do they?
No, he showed up with stakes. He had a purpose.
He showed up with a stake. He knew what he was there to do. There's not a really great effect when of her withering and dying whenever he stakes her in the heart. But when he goes back to Dracula's coffin after taking care of her, Dracula is no longer there, and he does get the better of Jonathan Harker.
Yeah, so this is a crazy divergence from the original story, because Jonathan Harker, in the novel, if you haven't read it, spoilers, escapes and is a important character for the whole story, for the rest of the story. And here, right at the point where Dracula would go to England and Jonathan would follow and try to stop him, he's killed. The man hunting Dracula, following him, is killed. No one's there to challenge Dracula right off the bat. But now
I was cool with it, though.
Yes, yes. The fight scenes in this movie are also not anything good. But it's very 1958.
Slow, choppy.
Yeah. Oh, blocking is what it's not choreography. It's blocking.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
But that's something to be said about this movie. And like you were saying, with how cool the crypt looks and everything, many times in this movie, I thought the scenes were painted. I didn't think they were real because they look so theatrical. That's the best way I would describe this movie, is theatrical. It oftentimes felt like I wasn't watching a movie, but I was watching a play that was filmed as if it was a movie.
Yeah, I kind of felt that way too. It reminded me of the like BBC recordings that they would do, of various things like Pride and Prejudice and such. It kind of had that same style to it. Or I think they even did one for Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I think this is most comparable to that.
Yeah, and I mean that's part of the charm, I think, to this movie for me. And the sets are really beautiful. This movie had a budget of £81,000, which is not
please,
much.
In American, please.
I don't know I don't know what the exchange rate is. I don't know what it was in 1958. That is a very foreign number to me and probably to most of us.
Okay, I looked it up. It's under $100,000.
Yeah, but
American.
You do have to, that was in 1958
right.
as well. So,
yeah. So they weren't working with much money, though.
Yeah.
Which, respect.
Yeah, and when the sets are built like that, clearly built from hand because they didn't have a crazy budget to just throw at the wall, it adds to the charm. And I really do appreciate how detailed the sets are. Like you were saying, these coffins and this crypt. They cared, they put some effort into it, put their back into that coffin. One weird thing about this movie is it entirely takes place in Romania. They use, because I looked it up, they're always going to these crazy cities that have German names. So it takes place in Germany and Romania, and in that sort of area of Europe. I don't think they ever go to England. I don't think any of them live in England, which is a weird change, I felt like. In the book, yeah, he's from Transylvania, but they never go to Germany. Nobody's German. I don't know what that changes. The book mostly takes place in England, and then, of course, Transylvania. I don't understand what that was about.
Yeah, I don't either. Yeah, you're right. They're in Klausenberg.
Yes. Well, I looked it up. They go to a few different cities. They go to a place called Karlstad as well. Karlstad is in Germany. Klausenberg is the German name for a Romanian town, which really strange. Really strange. They're using German names for Romanian places.
Maybe it was something with just the average viewer would know it by that. I don't know. I mean, they do establish that it's a town just near Transylvania, right? In the beginning of the movie, but you're right. I noticed that too. I thought it was weird.
Yeah, and they all have English accents.
They do, even Dracula.
Yeah, and so that also kind of adds to that play feel, because where else would you see a bunch of people doing British accents as a representation of European accent in a play? And of course they are British, so they were just speaking, but
yeah, that's a great point, actually. I mean, there is the school of thought that if you clearly establish the setting and, well, I guess that doesn't really work in this movie. What I was going to say was there's that school of thought that, if you clearly establish the setting and everybody that you're watching on the screen is from that setting, then there's no need to do the dialect if it's not mastered. That's a theater thing. But Jonathan Harker is new to this place, and Dracula is still canonically Romanian in this movie, so I don't actually know.
But then they're all
why they did that. They're
all in Germany for whatever reason. It's very strange. we could focus on it a little too much, but this plot, however, the changes they make, of course, Jonathan isn't here to give Dracula the deed to a house he bought. Dracula never bought a house in England. It doesn't even take place in England. So the whole reason Dracula leaves Transylvania is gone. The new reason they give is out of so here at the end of this part that takes place in Romania at the beginning, Dracula kills Jonathan, but Jonathan killed his bride before he died. So as revenge for killing his bride, Dracula has gone to turn Jonathan's wife into his new bride, and that is the plot. That is why Dracula shows up at these people's doorstep and starts wreaking havoc. One of the biggest criticisms and problems people have with the original novel is that there's an underlying kind of subtext of xenophobia, that like this strange rich foreigner is going to come to your land and steal your women and start killing people, and we talked about this a little bit in the last episode too. But here they kind of negate that problem by not making him this aristocratic foreigner.
That's true. That's a good point.
And they don't. Yeah,
I hadn't thought about it that way.
They don't reduce anybody to just being stock characters, stock, Slavic people or anything.
Right.
So they're at least able to remove I mean, that might not have even been intentional. I mean, it's not like people were up in arms about that in 1958. Nobody, honestly, it's not something you hear about much today. So I really doubt that they were probably focused on that, but points to this movie for it, I guess.
Yeah. It's after this scene where Jonathan Harker dies that we first meet Van Helsing as portrayed by Peter Cushing. And already, right, you get the sense that he is this stoic, kind of confident man. And he is there in Klausenberg, which, again, we don't know why it's called that, but he is on a mission looking for Jonathan Harker. And he does successfully obtain Jonathan Harker's journal, the very same one that he stashed outside, from the daughter of an innkeeper that is nearby. And he goes to Dracula's castle, and there is nobody there, but he does find the portrait that Jonathan had of the woman that he was pledged to marry, his fiancée. And this, of course, kind of lets him know that he is on the right track. It's a clue. And it kind of changes the tone of the movie.
Yeah, now they have to figure out Dracula's motives as well as stop him. In the book, they, of course, he's coming to England, he's going to eat people because he's Dracula. Here, stop him, yes, but stop him from what is what they're also trying to find out.
So now that Van Helsing knows exactly where he needs to go, he's at Dracula's castle. He goes and enters the same crypt that Jonathan had entered just before dying. And there, in Dracula's coffin, he finds Jonathan Harker. But this is not the Jonathan Harker that we all knew just 30 minutes of runtime ago. Jonathan is now a vampire. And Van Helsing makes quick work of him, stakes him straight in the heart, and goes back to Karlstadt to inform the folks that Jonathan Harker is dead. And he tells this to...
He goes to where we're introduced to Arthur Holmwood and his wife, Mina. And Arthur's sister, Lucy. So this is probably the strangest change for me from the book. A part of the story of the book is these characters are courting these two women that live together. They're roommates, Mina and Lucy. They have many suitors. They're very popular women. But Arthur ends up marrying Lucy, and Jonathan ends up marrying Mina. Weirdly, in this movie, Arthur is married to Mina, and his wife in the novel, Lucy, is his sister in this movie.
That was confusing for me.
It's a really weird change.
Yeah, but nonetheless, Lucy in this movie has fallen ill shortly after finding out the news of Jonathan. Did you like the sequence that followed? It speaks to sexy Dracula.
Oh, I do. Yeah, I feel like this sexy vampires nowadays, like Twilight or like that failed attempt at a sexy vampire in Van Helsing. Um, it's just sex appeal, like they're physically just attractive. But in the books and in this movie too, it does a good job. Sexy Dracula is more, it's more like he's literally put a spell on you. It's not so much sex appeal as it is like, a unholy seduction that you're kind of powerless to. They're not just attracted to him because he's sexy Dracula. They're literally put under his spell.
Lucy is, like I said, she's ill, and they've got her in a room by herself. But when the sun goes down and Lucy is by herself, not really being kept up with at the time, she ends up like opening the doors to her balcony and does this very dramatic walk. As she goes there, she opens the doors. She goes back to her bed, and she's wearing a rosary. But she, of course, removes it and lays in bed, sort of like offering herself to Dracula. And he does come. He comes and he bites her neck. Though I think they cut away right before he does it.
Yeah, oh, they do this great transition where he, like, throws his cloak up over her and it wipes the camera into darkness, and that's how they transition into the next scene. I thought it was great.
Yeah, that's right. The imagery of her, like, removing the cross from her neck and then laying down and like, preparing threw me. It made me laugh because it was very, very corny by modern standards. But could you have imagined what that would have done to, like, a 1960s Protestant person?
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
that would have deeply upset them.
They couldn't handle the polygamy. They were not about to.
Yeah. But you're right. It was very unholy. It is sort of a spell. And Christopher Lee is so imposing that when he enters that room and he just stands over the bed, he's 6'4", and this woman's, a relatively small person, especially when compared to him, and she's laid out ill. I don't know. It's a great scene.
Yeah.
And I'd forgotten about the wipe transition.
Yeah. We have all our characters here now, and I just want to touch on every iteration of these characters. I feel like is different, but these are pretty faithful to the book. Van Helsing is always such a strange character to me because he's been adapted a million times as like the vampire hunter, like in that movie we just watched. He's the guy that hunts Dracula. But in the book, he's just an old man. He's just a professor. He knows about vampires, and that's the reason they go to him in the first place. But he's not like physically able to do anything. He's an old man. He's part of a group of people that hunt Dracula, and it's all put onto him in all the adaptations that he's the guy. But it was really a group of people. And here we see that group. It's consisting of Van Helsing, Jonathan Harker, Arthur Holmwood, Mina, and the one character that is always removed. I don't think I've seen a single adaptation of this character, but in the book, maybe my favorite character. There's a character named Quincy Morris. Did you read the book?
The Texan?
The freaking Texan. There's a gunslinging cowboy from the newly formed Republic of Texas in the book. Why not make him the vampire hunter? You could have a literal cowboy hunting Dracula.
I so desperately want to see a Texan adaptation of Dracula.
I know. Bram Stoker was like, cowboys are cool. I'm putting one in my novel. And
why can't he be wanting to buy ranch land in Texas? I'm being serious, man. I think it'd be such a fun movie. Look, anyway, I don't know why they cut out Morris every time. I feel the same way. He's a great character. And he desperately wants to marry Mina.
There's also a character named Dr. Seward but he's barely in it. He's just like a doctor, but he's part of that group. I neglected to mention him earlier. I'm sorry. Dr. Seward Jonathan and Quincy Morris are all three trying to court Mina, and in the end of the day, she chooses Jonathan, but the other two respect her decision. So
Yeah, they're very polite about it.
they really are very polite about it. Yeah.
None of that happens here.
Yeah, I know. They've skipped that whole, and once again, it's an hour and 22-minute movie. They must move along.
So at this point, Dracula has already, I guess, had his way with Lucy. And again, it's very suggestive. But Van Helsing enters the following morning to treat her because everybody's still under the assumption that she's ill. But he pretty much immediately knows that something is wrong. Lucy ends up asking her maid, who is tending to her largely, to remove the garlic from her like prescribed diet, and Lucy ends up dying.
Yes.
Shortly after.
This is another thing I feel like has been lost in the modern ages about vampires that I really wish they'd bring back. You know, vampires nowadays, they like kill someone in the street, drain them of all their blood, and leave their corpse behind. But in the original book and in movies like this, in the classics, they're much more parasitic. Like Lucy doesn't die immediately. She's enthralled by Dracula, and he keeps feeding on her, like night after night after night. And she gets sicker and sicker and sicker, and her transition into death is more gradual, and her transition into undeath is therefore also more gradual. The turning of the vampire is sort of like they become sicker and sicker, less alive, and at the same time fall deeper into Dracula's spell to the point that they die and then become vampires themselves.
Yeah, and we do end up seeing Lucy just 3 days later become a vampire. And there's this little kid in the movie. She is the daughter of the maid, whose name is Gerda, right?
Yes. She was playing outside, and Lucy, who's supposed to be dead, shows up from the woods and is trying to get this child to come with her, but the child's afraid, so she runs back in, and this is how they discover Lucy has risen from the grave.
Yeah, her tomb is completely empty, and Van Helsing ends up having to ward her off with a cross. And we had already established earlier that they do stay loyal in that regard, right? Crosses and garlic are what keep the vampires at bay here. I had to look up whether or not that was something that Bram Stoker had created, if that was something that he had come up with for his novel. But apparently that goes back centuries and centuries. That sort of superstition of both religious iconography and garlic flower specifically keeping vampires away. And it can actually be traced back to like early East Asian culture too, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I've always thought garlic was like isn't that such an old, weird folklore monster remedy? Like, keep garlic on your windowsill and they can't get you, you know what I mean?
My family still thinks that garlic is like a cure-all.
Well, good. Has it worked for you?
I mean, I like it.
Yeah, I like garlic. I don't...
When I was young and I would have like asthma problems, my grandmother was convinced that eating a clove of garlic in the morning would cure it.
It would open the sinuses for sure.
Yeah, that's true.
I know. I'm sorry to throw us off track, but back to the plot.
No, it's okay. Yeah. It's at this point that Van Helsing actually wants to use Lucy to find where Dracula has gone, but his newly formed group, but I think mainly Arthur, decides that they're not going to do that, and instead they just stake Lucy, and they end up killing her for the final time.
Rest in peace.
And there's a great moment where Arthur can't watch the staking, but then after it's over, goes up to the coffin and takes a lingering look. And I really, really enjoyed it. He smiles because she's at peace. She's not ill or possessed anymore.
This is how you...
I thought that was a great scene.
Yeah, this is how you free their soul, and that's something in the book too. Here, they stake him in the heart, and that kills him. In the book, I'm pretty sure it's much more extreme than that. That you stake him in the heart, cut their head off, put a clove of garlic in the head's mouth, close the tomb and put a cross on top, and then throw holy water on the dirt around them. It's like a whole process.
But when you have a budget of 81,000 pounds sterling,
That's true, and I don't think in 1958 anyone was going to be showing heads get sawn off.
yeah, absolutely not.
Well, they do kill Lucy. I think it's that same night. Mina, she gets a message from some like ridiculously cockney chimney sweep looking hello governor kid. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
He's like, I've got a letter for you, ma'am, from your husband. And he like tells her to go visit an undertaker is what it is. Yeah. And she goes to visit him. It's not an undertaker. It's Dracula. and so now she is taking the place of Lucy. She has been enthralled and is under his spell and slowly is being fed on by Dracula. So I don't think Van Helsing and Arthur, they're searching for Dracula's coffin, but they're unable to. So they go back to see Mina, and they're very frightened for her safety. And just before they leave to go find Dracula's coffin, Arthur says, Mina, it would really make me feel a lot easier if you would please wear this cross. Please wear this cross when you go to bed. It's the one thing I ask. And she's very uneasy, and he gives it to her and puts it in her hand, and it burns her, revealing that she is turning.
And the burn is pretty good looking, right? I mean, it looks, for a 1958 movie, I didn't notice any like jump or anything in the footage. It was a good burn.
It's clearly like they were having fun with effects. Like
yeah,
they make
solid.
such a big dramatic kind of like shot because they know like in 1958 they know if you see this cross go into someone's hand and pulled away and there's a burn, they knew that would impress audiences, so they really focus on it.
Impressed me in 2022. I mean, I thought it looked really good. I was happy with it. So good on them. Thank you, Hammer. Later that night, Dracula comes back and he continues to feed on Mina. And Arthur gets this idea to do like a blood transfusion for Mina.
And that is also one of my favorite parts of the novel that clearly reflect the time. The two parts of the novel that I was like, oh wow, I guess that happened at that time in history, was Arthur Holmwood congratulates Quincy Morris at some point in the novel on his country becoming an independent government, meaning
right.
Texas. And I was like, damn, I guess. and the other thing is there's many instances in the novel where they do a blood transfusion because one of the characters has been sucked dry by Dracula and they need to give him some blood so they live. And they just do a blood transfusion from anyone right then and there. Like they clearly have no concept what a blood type is, but they do.
So incredible.
It's so crazy. Yeah. To see that in the novel. And I'm glad they kind of keep that alive here for at least one blood transfusion in this movie.
Also, this has nothing to do with the movie, but in the book, yeah, Morris is congratulated for the successful revolution and the Texas becoming a country. And I do think that was written in because Bram Stoker was Irish and there was that sort of, I think, longing to sever from the UK that still exists in certain parts of Ireland and Scotland today. But I digress.
They somehow fail to stop Dracula from getting into Mina's room, and he sucks her dry, and that's why they have to do that blood transfusion. But I was also talking about this, how, yeah, I think it's so funny in old-timey things, like, up until the 1950s, like, for way too long in human history, if someone had, like, a serious ailment, as a cure, they would just give you liquor. Like,
yeah, they call for wine.
Yeah, so she's got this blood transfusion, and so she needs like electrolytes, and he says, oh, Gerda, could you please go make her some coffee or tea, or better yet, get her some wine. Which Could you imagine you barely have any blood in your body and someone starts force feeding you wine?
The kind of remedy I'd think of.
Yeah, you're not staying conscious. But that's
Let's get some wine going.
Yeah. They ask Gerda to go fetch the wine, and she tells them, "Oh, well, Mina forbid me to go down into the cellar." And so they have this great realization where they bolt down into the cellar, and I didn't think this made too much sense. And that is where they find Dracula's coffin. It was in their house the whole time.
Right under their nose. And of course it's empty, and Dracula's not there.
Which isn't that, like... Dracula, have you never heard of the phrase, "Don't eat where you poop"? Because he did exactly that. Don't eat where you sleep, my guy.
Yeah, he did. And nonetheless, it worked, though.
Yeah,
and he
I guess
takes Mina and...
But before he can do that, they throw holy water all over his coffin. And now his coffin's ruined. So
that is true.
He's been a little bit...
He's still trying to make Mina his vampire wifey.
Yeah. And so now it's a race against... We gotta find him before he does that, yeah.
And so keep in mind that we've got quite a large event that's going to happen at this point in the movie. They have to find Mina. It's a race against time. And, like, literally it's a race against time because this movie has a runtime that's less than an hour and a half. And I think we're in the last 20 minutes of the movie.
Yeah.
So it has to happen quickly. And I will say this. I mean, I felt it rushing towards the end, but I was pretty satisfied with the pacing of this movie overall.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think you have to if you're gonna juggle a whole story with this amount of time.
Yeah.
Especially a story as grand as Dracula. So with Dracula's coffin destroyed, the only place he can sleep is back at his original burial ground in his crypt in his castle. So they know that's where he's headed with Mina. So he's rushing back to his castle with Mina. They have to rush back to stop him.
What Dracula tries to do, and I'm still not entirely clear why he was doing this within the context of the movie, and I don't even recall if this happens, like, if anything like this happens in the book, but he tries to bury her alive, like, outside of the crypt, and that's when Van Helsing and Arthur arrive. Why does he try to bury her alive? I guess to finish, like, killing her and convert her?
Yeah. I think she has to be buried once she dies to become a vampire, because vampires need burial earth, the earth they're buried in, basically, in order to, like, recharge. But no, he never does that in the book. In the book, he doesn't even, like, kidnap Mina. He simply starts to feed on her, and she begins turning into a vampire. So it is a race against time, because she will turn into a vampire otherwise, but he doesn't actually physically take her anywhere.
Once Van Helsing and Arthur get there, Dracula makes his way into the castle, and we get another chase. And then we get another really awful physical struggle.
Yeah.
Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee do this, like, just horribly blocked physical struggle.
Well, this is also another thing of, like, it's a play. It's because the combat is terrible. I mean,
it's bad, and Dracula's foil at the end of this is rather milquetoast. Van Helsing tears away the curtains and lets in the sunlight. And then he creates a cross using two candlesticks that are nearby. And all of this, the combination of things, I guess him holding the cross of Dracula and the sunlight pouring in, causes Dracula to become dust. And it's like this combination of three shots where they show, I'm not entirely sure what it was, if it was like a clay dummy or some sort of bust that they had created, but it's not great. Not even by 50s standards is it great, but they show him slowly turning into dust as Van Helsing watches him die and wither.
Yeah, I mean, the dust effect is fun, but then it's like they have like one, clearly a guy, they have like a skeleton arm that a guy clearly off camera is like kind of shaking.
Yeah.
Then Mina recovers and the scar fades from her hand.
It's lame, because the scar was cool.
Well, that's what happens in the book too.
I know. The scar's cool. I mean, look, if you're already taking this many liberties,
Make this. Well, how will they know she's not a vampire?
that's true. This movie would go on to spawn 8 canon sequels, if you can believe it.
Yeah, we like to imagine
8 canon sequels.
Yeah, we imagine like slashers having franchises or being a franchise, but these old movie monsters, these old monster movies, are franchises just as much. Like, people were eagerly awaiting, the next Dracula movie's coming out. You know, it's strange to imagine that being the case, but it was.
Yeah, I don't know, and that's kind of, I obviously am not from the 60s, but that's a cool thing to think about, right? But this is fun because it's such a classic character, and Hammer sort of revitalized him and did a fairly good job. You know, people love these movies, and there are plenty that didn't do well, and there are many that don't even have Christopher Lee in them. I don't believe he was in The Brides of Dracula. He took like an 8-year break between the first movie and the next one that he would go on to do, and then begrudgingly participated in, you know, several others. Him and Peter Cushing ended up only doing 3 together, I think, though, just because of the way things worked out. But let me tell you, I know that he felt that it bogged down his career, but I'm really grateful we have these movies. And the 2 that I've seen that Hammer made, I've had a really fun time as a Christopher Lee fan watching him do something in his youth.
In his relative youth. Did you actually know?
Relative youth.
I don't think he even pursued acting as a career until he was in his 40s.
Really?
Yeah, I think he's like 40 years old in this movie or something.
Wow. Well, and I know that he dreamed of being an opera singer.
I can see that. He has such a deep voice.
You know, I really enjoyed this movie personally. I will say that it's not the most accessible thing. How did you watch it?
I found it to be incredibly accessible because it was simply thrown up on YouTube.
It was thrown up on YouTube, and that's how I watched it too. But that will probably get taken down eventually.
Yeah, probably, but not right now.
I just find that, like, I was looking around, and the only real way I could find it streaming was for like $4 on Amazon. And yes, it's on YouTube, and I imagine that will not last. But the DVDs for these movies, did you look at all?
Oh, no, I haven't.
Oh my god, the DVDs and the VHSs even for these movies, and I'm sure there's a Blu-ray collection somewhere, but I didn't look for it or find it, but they are so freaking collectible now. And I guess it's because Hammer was independent and didn't mass produce a lot of physical media. But man, kind of crazy. So if you're watching this and if you want to watch this and you can find the YouTube video still by the time this is uploaded, then please watch it. If not, I'd still say, like, I would have paid money to watch this. Like, I would have paid the $4 rental fee. Personally.
Oh yeah, well, back in the day, I think I would have even paid that quarter to get into the movie theater. Drive-in movie theater with Stacy, who I'm going steady with.
You take her to Make Out Rock afterwards?
Yeah. Well, that way when she gets afraid, I'm there.
Jesus.
Going steady.
Her dad wants her home by 7 p.m. No later, young man.
She snuck out because it's a late night showing.
Ooh. Careful. Don't let her mama find out about the burning cross scene.
Well, thank you for joining me, Adrian.
Hey, thanks for having me in the front seat of your 1958 Chevy.
Of course, yeah. Well, thank you everybody for listening. Goodbye.